Bible study of Second Peter, looking today at verses 4 through the first half of verse 10. 4 through 10a. Well, it's time to get to Peter's three Old Testament examples of evil and the judgment that went along with that evil. He's making a point, of course, trying to get across the fact that people who are ungodly, in particular we're talking about false teachers, that such people will not go unpunished. There will be an immediate punishment typically, and an eternal punishment at the great white throne. So let's take a look at those, and in the process we'll take a look at Jude's parallel set of three examples. Well, example number 1, found in verse 4 of 2 Peter 2. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but he cast them into hell, and that's a point we'll want to make. The word for hell is the word for Tartarus here, and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. So this placing them into hell and or Tartarus and the pits of darkness, that's not what the eventual judgment will be. There will be a judgment beyond that. So he's going to tell us the three examples where you saw the judgment and then you will know the future judgment. So why are they in these pits? Reserved for the day of judgment. So, first is a question of angels. Which angels is Peter talking about? Certainly he's not talking about the elect angels, those who did not defect with Satan. So what does that leave us? That leaves us with the angels who did fall, who are typically called demons. Again, certainly not all demons even are in this category, as you just saw. Said some of them this happened to, but we know from Scripture that there are demons loose in the world to do Satan's bidding. So, which angels is Peter talking about? Well, the best guess of scholars seems to be from Genesis 6, 1 through 3, where it spoke about the sons of God creating evil offspring. And the supposition is that this was demons controlling evil men, giants in many cases it appears, so as to produce evil offspring. That seemed to have been their goal in doing this, lusting after women. Probably wasn't needed for the demons to put that in the heads of these men, but once they became entrenched in the person, then that was what took place. Jude gives us the same example, but with a tad more information that leads me at least to believe that we were talking about those angels, those demons in Genesis 10:6. Although if you go back, demons are not mentioned specifically there. That's an assumption we make about the men called the sons of God. We do not suspect that they were hybrids, but they were men indwelt by demons. So let me read Jude 6. And angels who did not keep their own domain, in other words, they didn't stay put where they were, but they abandoned their proper abode, not a proper, but their proper abode, And it says, then God has kept in eternal bonds under darkness. Why? For the judgment of the great day, which we believe to be the great white throne judgment. So we've got a couple of things. We've got angels that went astray. They were fallen angels. They even went beyond what most fallen angels take, and so God locked them up somewhere, took them out of circulation completely. That's one thing we are relatively certain of. The second is that being locked up isn't their final punishment. That awaits the great day of judgment. Now, all angels originally had jobs with some authority in some place. That place was most likely heaven, and the authority varied. They had jobs to do, praising God, ministering to God, and doing God's bidding. Scholars generally believe that the fall of Satan and angels is described by Isaiah and by John in Revelation. Let me read you parts of those two passages. I'm reading in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12, 13, and 14. And you're not going to see Satan spelled out directly here, but you'll get the message. If you haven't seen it already, most have, I feel. How are you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn? And day star would be something very beautiful. How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low, you who said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, which of course is God. So this star of day star, who was the son of the dawn, was probably an angel with tremendous authority and power, took it upon himself to say, I'm going to be like God. I like what I see he has, is, and does. I'm going to have the same, do the same, be the same. And in Revelation 12:4, we see the phrase, his tail, that's this person we just spoke about, I believe, as the day star. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And of course, we believe this is a description of Satan after his fall, taking a third of the angels in heaven, and they fell with him, and they were cast down to the earth. But what's the fate of those fallen angels that Peter's talking about? What's their future? You can read it in Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9 if you wish to go there. I would recommend it. The eventual end of all demons, of course, is a done deal. That's also spelled out in Revelation 12, 7 through 9. Their fate is fixed, and it ain't pretty. According to both Peter and Jude, some demons are already in chains, experiencing a lockup somewhere in outer darkness while awaiting their final disposition in judgment. But notice, the current fate isn't all. As I said a moment ago, they're being held for a final judgment that is yet to take place. They know it. We know it. Peter and Jude knew it. Now note that, again, I mentioned this earlier, that some translations say these angels were cast into hell. It's not really the term for Hades. It's a Greek term, Tartarus, which in the Greek world referred to a place even below Hades and held for the worst of the worst. So that's where these guys are. They're being held in some place of darkness and solitude, of course. They're in a place where the worst of the worst are found. Wherever it is, you don't want to be there. What was Peter and Jude's purpose for giving this example? I think it was a simple warning. It goes something like this. Hey, if God would do that to wayward angels and hold angels accountable for eventual judgment, do you think wayward or evil humans will escape judgment? Not very likely. So I think that was the reason that that particular example was given. Let's go on. If I can quit yawning, let's go on and look at Peter's number 2, found in verse 5 of 2 Peter 2. And did not, and this is God, did not spare the ancient world. Now he's switched from angels to humans, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And that's in what? Genesis 11 and 12. You know the story very well, that God got so disgusted. And by the way, it was after these sons of God, these wayward angels, were producing evil offspring. God took a look at the world and said, man, it's so bad, it's going, I got to get rid of all of this evil. But there was a man named Noah who was considered by God to be righteous. And along with Noah, his 3 sons, Noah's wife, and the wives of Noah's 3 sons, a total of 8 people, were preserved out of the others. That means that everyone in the world was drowned by the flood. Everyone who was drowned had rejected Noah's offer. Everyone who drowned was unrepentant and enemy of God and never reconciled to God. So those people were judged by death, being taken out of the world with no opportunity to get right with God. So their judgment awaits that final day of judgment, just as those angels who are currently locked up. But notice he makes a second point that's crucial here. Noah was a preacher of righteousness with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world. And Noah was preserved, Peter says, from that judgment. So what is he telling us? God can and does and has protected his own people from general judgments that take place on evil. Think about it. Not all angels are locked up. The elect angels certainly are not. They are in heaven doing the things that angels were originally designed to do. Praise God, minister to God, and do his bidding. Not even, however, all of the fallen angels were locked up. Only those determined in this judgment to have gone a step too far. So what do we have so far? God's preserved some out of judgment while executing his judgment on those he has decided on to execute the judgment. But so there's a second major point in the second example. God destroyed the entire people earth, but he protected those he considered his own, even though they turned out not all to be what you would like them to have been. Only the ungodly were hit with the judgment, and everyone judged ungodly was hit with that judgment. In other words, who did God target with judgment? Precisely those he intended to judge at that point. Now think about this for a second. Didn't he do that same thing in Egypt? Not many, at least some of the plagues with which God struck Egypt, in some of those, his Jewish people, they were called Hebrew at that time, his Hebrews, chosen people, were protected and kept from those plagues. So God proves at any point in time, under any judgment, for any reason, he is able to target the judgment specifically for the ungodly and away from his own people. Let's look at Jude 5 and see who Jude had here. Jude's, a matter of fact, going to talk about the people I just mentioned in Egypt. Jude 5. Now I desire, and this is Jude writing, though you, the target audience, know all things once for all. This is where, like Peter, is saying, I know you know this, but let me remind you that after he saved a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed all those who did not believe. Actually destroyed those who did not believe. I added the word all, it's implied, because there's no limiting of the destruction except to those who did not believe. Well, what does that tell you? Out of Egypt, with this great mob of people that we call Hebrews, or today we call Jews, came some who were not believers. If you want to call this a kingdom that came out of Egypt, that kingdom had included many who were God's people, but it included many who were not God's people. And what does Jude say? Those who were not God's people and whom got in the way in these wanderings in the wilderness, they were destroyed by God. They were taken out. And they, like the angels, await a final judgment also. To the Jews, who were Jude's example, that came too close to home to the Jews. Now remember, these are New Testament Jews we're talking about at this time. They heard Jude say Yahweh brought a people, not all truly his people, out of slavery in Egypt, but once out, the ungodly among God's people were put to death in the wilderness. So there's two examples, one angel, one human. But in both cases, some were judged immediately for the evil, all await future judgment but some were not judged. Some were taken and given protection according to God's choice. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3 is another example I'm sure you know about. Everyone's heard about this, whether they're believers or not. And if he, that's God, condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly thereafter. So, he's saying, Sodom and Gomorrah were taken out as examples to those who want to go that way. And if he rescued righteous Lot and a couple of daughters and his wife temporarily, at least, there's a case again. Immediate judgment by fire, or immediate judgment at least, is said by fire, because Sodom and Gomorrah were reduced to ash. Some were protected, Lot and his family, and those who were not protected were judged and still await a final judgment. Verse 7, and if he, God, rescued righteous Lot, expressed by the oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, those were the ones who were judged. For by what he saw and heard, that's what Lot saw and heard, that righteous man Lot, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented. Lot felt his soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds. So he's just pointing out that there was someone who was protected and saved out of that judgment that took out 2 complete cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. And you're going to come back at me and say, I know something from the Old Testament said Lot wasn't righteous. Well, Lot had some problems, no doubt. But here, Peter has said he was considered righteous by God. There was something he believed by faith that separated Lot from the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So again, two points. Ungodly paid a price for their ungodliness by immediate judgment, and those, however, who God considered his own were kept safe. God knows how to separate the wheat from the chaff. But what about Jude's number 3? Well, guess what? It's Sodom and Gomorrah also. Only on number 2 did Jude and Peter differ. But those were both human cases and in some sense related. Verse 7 of Jude. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah, but look at what Jude adds, and the cities around them. So we're not just talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're talking about all the cities in that region that evidently were as evil as Sodom and Gomorrah. And he goes on, since they in the same way as these, as Sodom and Gomorrah, indulged in gross immorality, you know that always means sexual immorality, and went after strange flesh, in case you didn't catch that part, are exhibited, this is why God did it, they're exhibited, they're put up for you to see as an example in undergoing punishment of eternal fire. There's also a hint, this fire that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire and the brimstone and sulfur, that sort of thing, there is an eternal fire. And that's being hidden in what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. So, Jude added 2 things. Additional towns around Sodom and Gomorrah were likely suffered the same fate as Sodom and Gomorrah. That fate was fire and sulfur. It was a burning. But Jude omitted the protection of Lot and his family. Peter knew it. He goes on back in 2 Peter 2:9, just after he's talked about the judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. Peter goes on to say, "Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation, and to keep the unrighteousness under punishment for the day of judgment." It seems like it's maybe a question of anyone's ability to keep me awake this afternoon. This is midday, so no reason to be sleepy, but I'm yawning. Maybe I've been sitting and talking too long. Well, if that's the case, we'll finish quickly, and you can wait till the next session, see if I'm still yawning. Peter was going to wind up his section session here and I'm just going to look at the first half of verse 10. And especially, and he's been talking about those being judged, and he said especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. That's interesting. There we go again. Indulge the flesh, of course, talks about describing immoral sexual liaisons. Those kind of people are singled out. Why might you think Peter would single those out right now? Keep that in mind, because it's coming up. There's a reason why he's singling out these characteristics. Whose authority is despised? That's the second part of that statement. I believe it's Jesus Christ, but it probably could be anyone else in authority who is witnessing of his faith. Jude went a bit further in mentioning this activity of rejecting authority. He's making a point, and it's a little hard to think about at first, but when you do, it's not hard to see. He's saying, when you reject authority, you need to be careful. I'm going to read verses 8, 9, and 10 of Jude. I need some Pepsi. Yet in the same manner, these men, that's false teachers he's talking about now, also by dreaming, remember, they are the ones who use made-up stories, made-up tales, also by dreaming defile the flesh and reject authority. So Jude is saying the same thing about these false teachers. And revile, he goes on one step further, revile angelic majesties. And so this is similar to Peter's assessment, except he goes a bit further. And he's going to talk about Michael, who is an angel, an archangel. In verse 9 he goes on to say, but Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil, so he was arguing with Satan, and argued about the body of Moses. Remember, the body of Moses was buried outside the camp with no human's knowledge. But said when it was buried on that mountain, Michael was disputing with Satan. And he said whatever the dispute was, Michael did not dare pronounce against Satan a railing judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Michael was essentially saying, the Lord's going to get you, Satan. He's going to rebuke you. And that's his job, not mine. I'm not going to take God's job away from him. But remember, we suspect that Satan was the top archangel. And Michael, being an archangel, would have respected who Satan had been. So he's backing off, saying, I'm not going to bring judgment against you. I'm going to let the Lord judge you, which is where we are to be when it comes to discussing and judging what we think is someone's or going to be someone's end. We are not to judge their end because we will not know it unless we are told by God. And verse 10, but these men, that's the false teachers again, revile the things which they do not understand, and the things which they know only by instinct, like unreasoning animals. By these things they are destroyed. So Jude is pronouncing a future judgment on false teachers because they were going after false flesh, defile the flesh, reject authority, revile angelic majesty, doing the same thing that Peter was doing, and he's saying, don't sweat it, because those people will one day be destroyed. Judgment will be final. It may not be in this life, but justice will come. Well, Jude isn't finished, and neither is Peter, folks. But they've given us 3 examples that say you better pay attention to this, particularly if you are one of these false teachers. You better pay attention, because if you think you're going to get by with this, you're nuts. So what Peter and Jude have told us to this point, well, several things. Through their Old Testament examples, they've told us God can punish ungodly who reject him. He has punished ungodly behavior, and he does it. He put it in print so we would know it. God can protect his own in the midst of that judgment. God has exhibited that by protecting his own in the midst of the 3 judgments discussed. Not only may there be immediate punishment for the ungodly, there also awaits a final judgment at the great white throne, from which true believers also will be protected and exempted. You can take solace in the fact that one day all evil will finally be punished totally and eradicated. Never forget something we saw last time in Psalm 1:6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And that God is the one who separates so that his righteous ones, covered in the righteousness of Christ, do not, will not, cannot perish. And then the author of Hebrews makes an additional promise. He, God himself, has said, I will never desert you, the true believer, nor will I ever forsake you, true believer, so that we, true believers, confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? And Jesus said, don't sweat it if they can kill the body, because they can't touch your soul. So the point of describing how to spot false teachers, that's where we're going next time. And we're going to look first at their behavior, then we'll also talk about what they teach. It ain't over, folks. We're not there. We'll get there. Taking off next with the second half of verse 10 of chapter 2.